I need your concentration just to feel your vibration at that soul shakedown party tonight. We're gonna have a soul shakedown party.
Good afternoon. I'm Vishnu Das on Yoga News Network. Today's top story: discrimination in yoga. On the path of the Bhagavad Gita, the first sustained effort that the seeker must make is discrimination, and this forms the foundation for the rest of the journey. On today's episode, we'll look at the concept, process, and impact of discrimination, with help from some special guests. First, a quick definition. The word discrimination has several common meanings, and in yoga, discrimination has nothing to do with discriminating against anyone or anything. Rather, for a yogi, discrimination refers to the capacity to distinguish between that which will take the seeker toward the highest goal and that which will perpetuate the bondage or attachment to non-yogic living. For more on this topic, we go live to our remote studio in Northern California, and our first guest, Yogi. For those of you that missed the previous episode, Yogi lives in a remote cabin and practices the yoga of Bhagavad Gita. Yogi sir.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Thank you for joining us.
Vishnu Das, you and I are one. My body may be joining your program, but we are always together, the same soul, inseparable.
One love, one life.
Thank you, Yogi sir. It is so refreshing when you remind me. As noted, today's topic is discrimination. Will you share with us your experience in that regard?
First, let us put this into context. Discrimination comes in chapter 2 of Gita. And as you mentioned, it forms the foundation. But the foundation of what? Swamiji often says that the yogi's experience must stand on a strong infrastructure of awareness. That way, as the yogi proceeds on the path, each new layer of the structure can support the next level that comes above it.
I see.
So discrimination is the first way, and the most important way, for the yogi to begin to build and strengthen a foundation of awareness. By discriminating between the experiences of the material world and the awareness of the spiritual plane, the yogi begins to develop the ability to reduce the attachments to that which is perceived through the senses and to become more linked with that which is beyond the senses, the spiritual consciousness. Chapter 2 of Gita explains discrimination in detail. And for me, there are 12 key verses in that chapter which anchor the concept and are critical for my sadhana. Let us take a few of them. First, verse 109. So the message is just don't dwell on the sense perceptions. It's not that easy. Let's look at verse 114. Now consider, how much time during the day are your thoughts not linked with what you see, hear, taste, touch, and smell? So how does a yogi begin to practice this? By controlling the senses. This requires conscious and constant practice and a thorough commitment by the yogi. Always remember, Gita was revealed in a battlefield, and that battle is a metaphor for the battle in consciousness. It's easy to deceive oneself. For example, when I began on the Gita path, I enjoyed drinking coffee. And one day my loving wife asked me why I drank it. My reply was that I enjoyed the taste. And anyway, I was only drinking it on the weekends, So it was under control. Then I realized that I was fooling myself, because as I looked deeper, I recognized that really what I liked about the coffee was the stimulus. And I was running after that stimulus every Saturday and Sunday.
I see.
There's a verse in chapter 18 where Lord Krishna speaks of withdrawing intelligence from desire. Now think about that for a moment. If your intelligence is linked with desire, then your intelligence, your intellect, could actually become an ally of the desire and work against you. Even the intellect can fool you if the intellect is not linked with that which is above the intellect. This is mentioned in the end of chapter 3 of Gita. So I stopped drinking coffee. Now, there is nothing wrong with coffee, but for me, in my process, I felt progress when I stopped drinking this coffee, and I was able to do without, and I stopped thinking about it. As the mother of Pondicherry wrote, it gives more satisfaction to conquer a desire than to satisfy the desire. The key to this entire process is the intellect, or buddhi. Lord Krishna refers to this as buddhi yoga.
For more on this, we go now to a breaking story that's nearly 50 years in the making. We're live with Dr. Burdock Grumpenhammer, professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Colorado and a striving yogi himself. Welcome, Dr. Grumpenhammer.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You recently published groundbreaking research on the topic of spiritual awakening around the world. One of the studies you cited that really caught my attention was where you looked at expansion of consciousness in America, and the fact that although America has a strong collective intellect and a history of intellectual achievements, that did not lead directly to cultural dissemination of the yoga of intellect. So your conclusion that a strong intellect does not necessarily translate to yoga of intellect or buddhi yoga. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Yeah, it's not a question of the intellect's power, but rather how the intellect is directed, or shall we say, misdirected. As you mentioned, I have a theory on this going back 50 years. To truly assess the scope of the situation, we need to look at the history. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, spiritual masters from India were coming to America and finding very, very receptive audiences, especially among the young people. It was almost the time of mass awakening. Almost. The universe had a plan for America. And as with everything else in the material plane, it began first in the subtle plane. This vibration, if you will, this vibration of awakening, it first began to resonate in the cosmos. And as it descended to earth consciousness by some twist of fate, the signal was misinterpreted.
Misinterpreted?
Yeah, you see, what is the first type of effort that a seeker must make on the spiritual path? Discrimination. And in order to discriminate, one must use the intellect, or buddhi. Our research indicates that the signal coming to Earth was a call to wake the buddhi to a higher possibility, to make the buddhi the tool for progress in yoga and daily life, and to take the buddhi into every situation.
Wake the buddhi, make the buddhi, take the buddhi. That sounds like a perfect campaign for mass awakening. What happened, Professor?
Again, this is just a theory, but my team's analysis indicates that although the signal coming to America was quite strong, there was, as we recall, already quite a bit of upheaval in American society. It was such a confusing time that the signal became distorted. And we saw in early 1976, just months after Maharshi Mahesh Yogi appeared on the cover of Time magazine, the dance of Prakriti and Purusha took, shall we say, an unintended turn.
Wake the Buddhi became something else.
Exactly. It became
Shake Your Booty by Casey and the Sunshine Band became the #1 hit in America and around the world. It came to symbolize the disco dance era and is still popular today.
Shake, shake, shake. Shake, shake, shake. Shake your booty. Shake your booty.
Thank you, Professor, for that wonderful thesis. If I may summarize, the signal was coming to awaken to spirit, but that signal, or that cosmic alarm clock, if you will, was not fully heard, and thus people were only partially awakened, and they did not make that critical first step. They didn't gain traction on the spiritual path by committing to the practice of discrimination and the yoga of intellect. And so the message, I think, in Professor's dance video is not that there's anything wrong with dance. Simply, as a yogi, one should first wake the buddhi and then maintain that yogic consciousness, discriminate in every situation so that the consciousness remains pure and one does not go into indulgence. Yogi, what's your view on this?
Certainly there's nothing wrong with dance. Dance is a beautiful art form. It can be a wonderful experience of self-expression, celebration, even exercise. The question is, what is the consciousness with which this dance is performed? If the yogi can maintain the awareness, the yogic awareness, while dancing, and recognize why she is dancing, what is the motivation, and be brutally honest with herself, whether it is due to some vital pull, then there's no problem with dance. It may not be harmful, it may not be helpful, but it's certainly not an obstacle to yoga. I in my younger days, I was known to dance now and then.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Our researchers actually located some archival footage of you dancing. Would you mind if we played that?
I was not aware that such footage exists. That must be back from when I had a lot of hair. Sure, certainly. Go ahead.
Nice moves, Yogi. On today's episode, we spent a lot of time on the concept of discrimination, but what about the process and its impact? For a close-up look where the rubber meets the road, we'll go now to everyone's favorite bicycle mechanic, Winston Wheels. Hi, Winston!
Dude, hey, I'm just getting ready to go for a bike ride, and it turns out bicycling is a perfect analogy for discrimination on the yoga path. Think about when you learned how to ride a bicycle. You really weren't trying to push the pedals very hard. It wasn't about speed. It was about trying to keep the bicycle from falling over, right? Keeping your balance. And that took a lot of focus and a lot of effort, a lot of attention, concentration. You had to constantly think about it. But as you developed, you had to think about it less and less. And now, when you get on a bicycle, it doesn't even enter your mind. The balance is there. Similarly, when the yogi begins to practice discrimination, it takes constant effort, constant focus, practice, and diligence. And it's a conscious action. But just like the balance on the bicycle became a natural process, the discrimination becomes a natural process. You no longer have to think about it. It becomes integrated.
Tell us more.
Here's an example. You're walking down the street and you see an attractive man or woman coming the other way. Naturally, the eyes, the senses, the sense of sight or vision is pulled to that attractive object. maybe it's not a woman or a man. Maybe it's a fine painting or a beautiful automobile or a beautiful building. Anything it could be. Anything attractive to the sense of sight. And as you mentioned earlier, Vishnudas, when you looked at verse 114, when the senses get pulled toward the objects of enjoyment, it diverts your consciousness away from the self. So the yogi knows that's not optimal, right? Because the idea, the goal is to keep the consciousness focused on the self or the soul, spiritual consciousness. This becomes a natural process rather than a conscious action. And when that happens, things become very smooth. The yogi is able to maintain what Gita calls a state of equanimity. The yogi is not disturbed in any situation. And that consciousness, that state, that vibration of that person, it's not just felt inside the yogi, it's actually felt, perceived, it's palpable to those around the yogi. Other people say and feel, wow, that person's so calm. That person handles every situation with aplomb. That person is so steady. How can I be more like that person? I just got a speeding ticket. I was just involved in an accident. I just saw a very disturbing thing. But if that person was here, he or she would be very calm. How can I be like that? So that vibration begins to spread to other people. It's what Swamiji refers to as transmission.
Very interesting.
Swamiji often says that life moves on two tracks, experience and awareness. Similarly, bicycle, bi means two. Bicycle moves on two wheels. One wheel is where all the work is done. You have to push this wheel, apply pressure to create forward motion. The other wheel is just for steering. So it doesn't do the work, but it's important about where the bicycle goes, just like awareness is important about where the consciousness goes. When you have a balance between the two, then your consciousness will be in harmony, your track will be smooth, your progress will be assured.
So the rear wheel is experience, while the front wheel is awareness. That's fascinating. To close out today's episode, let's look at a tip from Swami Sri Atmananda that he shared during the advanced course on the Yoga of Bhagavad Gita. Swamiji recommended that when the yogi begins to practice sense control and discrimination and enters that battlefield in consciousness, the yogi should first assess which of the senses are strongest and which are weaker. And rather than targeting the stronger senses first, the yogi should begin with the weaker senses and gain strength and find success there first. He gave the analogy that in a real battle, you don't first attack the enemy's general, you begin with the foot soldiers and work your way through the defenses. And with a parting word, we'll ask Yogi to summarize in one sentence the importance of discrimination. Yogi?
If practiced diligently, discrimination leads to equanimity, which is itself a monumental transformation in consciousness, and prepares the yogi for yogic action.
Thank you. And thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Secrets of the Path, here on Yoga News Network. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Don't worry about a thing, 'cause every little thing gonna be alright. Singing don't worry rise up this morning, smile with the rising sun.